This is NDTV, and you're watching Classics.
Hello and welcome to this very special show. My guest today is Stephen Roach. He's the chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia, and for 25 years now he's been the chief economist at Morgan Stanley. Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Yes.
You've been consistently bearish. Bearish may not be the right word to use here, but you've always pointed to the pitfalls on this great growth story that we've seen panning out for now several years. But now, you were also one of the first people to call what's now become the subprime crisis, but which began as a housing problem. So, how do you see that problem panning out? Is it going to be the wealth effect? Are people going to start feeling poorer as house prices come down and keep spending less and less?
Well, first of all, let me just qualify the bearish label. I've been bearish on the United States. I've been bullish on Asia. So Morgan Stanley has moved me out to Asia in order to keep me happy in a part of the world where I'm most optimistic. I do think the United States is on the brink of what could be a fairly serious downturn or recession. The subprime crisis is really the tip of the iceberg, the early warning sign, to use a euphemistic American phrase, the canary in the coal mine. American consumers have been asset dependent for 6 years. Income growth has lagged, and yet consumption is at a record 72% of U.S. GDP. And so now the wealth effect that has driven consumption to such excess for so long has turned. House price inflation has slowed dramatically and will probably go negative next year for the first time in our history. And meanwhile, the subprime crisis makes it very difficult for consumers to refinance or lever the asset to keep supporting current consumption. So I think the consumption ratio at 72% of US GDP has nowhere to go but down. And the American consumer is the biggest consumer in the world by a long shot. And so if the US consumer fades here, I do believe that export-dependent developing Asia will be in trouble, and yet you'd never know that from the euphoric state of Asian equity markets.
So from being bullish on Asia, you're now slowly turning bearish on Asia as well?
Well, I'm still fundamentally optimistic on developing Asia, but I think the idea that Asia has decoupled from the United States, whatever happens in the U.S. Doesn't matter in Asia anymore, I think that's wrong, and I think that will be tested over the next year. Yes, the United States has slowed over the past year, and Asia has done just fine. But the slowing that's occurred in the United States thus far has been concentrated in home building activity, which is not a global sector in any way whatsoever. The slowing that I see unfolding will be in the American consumer, which is our most global sector. Asia, again, export dependent, biggest end market demand is the US. I think Asia will feel that. There will be a cycle in Asia, and that will be the surprise for Asian equity markets.
You don't really feel that there's going to be a kind of a soft landing and then a slight takeoff in the US? Because we're hearing a contrarian opinion on this, saying that if the US allows its currency to weaken sufficiently, then you might have an export-led growth there, which is driven by US manufacturing and US exports to the rest of the world.
I think that the weaker dollar has provided a bit of a cushion for U.S. exports, but so much of our manufacturing industry has really been decimated over the last 20 years that it is inconceivable to me that we will be able to offset a slowing of 72% of our GDP with an improvement in manufacturing, which employs now only about 10% of the U.S. workforce. So I don't believe in this optimistic soft landing scenario that you alluded to.
How about something like, IT-driven, technology-driven exports, which are probably services exports, capital exports?
Well, look, in a large economy like the United States, there are always a lot of cross currents, and I do think that there will be sectors that are both winners and losers, but the overwhelming macro force likely to be at work in the United States is going to be a pullback of our enormous personal consumption sector. When you take a consumption sector up to 72% of GDP. Right. It's a number that's never been recorded for any major economy in the history of the world. When that goes to excess and now it corrects, there's not much that's going to stand in the way of an overall downturn in the macroeconomy.
Now, a consumption downturn that happens, how does that feed into, in terms of percentage points, numbers, how much do you feel that that could affect the overall GDP growth?
Well, the consumption growth has been about 3.7% a year now for 12 years in a row. Income growth has been about 0.6 of a point less than that. I think consumption growth over the next couple of years could average no more than 2 percentage points, possibly 1.5 percentage points. That's a reduction of 2 percentage points of consumption growth from the 12-year trend. That would knock off close to 1.5 percentage points off of the U.S. GDP, and that would be a considerably weaker engine supporting the global economy. And at some point in the next couple of years, we could actually have some negative growth for a while, which would be a recession.
And that would mean 3 quarters in a row?
2.
2 quarters in a row, negative growth?
Yes.
So, but you anticipate that happening?
I think there's slightly better than a 50-50 chance that we will see that within the next year.
And if that happens, if the US actually goes into a recession, which are the Asian economies which are most vulnerable, the first line of shock?
Well, I think the first line impact will go to China, given the huge export share of the Chinese GDP and
the China GDP growth correlation with the US is still fairly low, over a 7-year period.
Well, yeah, but I think what that means is that China faces a US slowdown with a huge cushion. It's growing 11%.
That's right.
So what I would see in the case of China is simply a very modest slowdown into, say, the 8 to 9% area. Other Asian economies have a much thinner cushion, like Japan. Japan's a 2% growth economy, and Japan exports heavily to the United States. It also exports heavily to China, which turns around and reassembles the Japanese components into products that go to America. So Japan could go from 2 to 0. Korea, Taiwan, more 4 to 4.5% economies. They could also get hit, but their outcome is likely to be positive growth. I think the one Asian economy that worries me the most in the event of a U.S. slowdown would be Japan.
And that impact in terms of the fact that Japan is the second largest economy in the world today.
Yes.
So that would have a considerable ripple effect all over. Would that tend to magnify the impact from the U.S.?
Yes, it would. We have a lot of intra-regional trade, which is driving the Asian economy. So when the U.S. slows, it reverberates throughout this increasingly China-centric supply chain, which feeds the U.S. India, though, I think would be relatively unscathed given the limited exposure, both directly and indirectly, to the United States.
But India, we have some sectors. Yes. In fact, we have 3 sectors which are heavily U.S. exports dependent. One, of course, is well known, that's IT. The second is pharma. And the third is textiles. So these 3 sectors could feel the heat.
I think textiles would definitely feel the heat, and the currency is exacerbating that right now, from what I understand. I think IT, ironically, would be counter-cyclical, because as companies in the United States feel margin pressure, there could be some cyclical increase in their demand for efficiency solutions through Indian BPO providers.